The smell of oil and hot metal hung thick over the Ford River Rouge plant. The air pulsed with the clang of hammers, the hiss of welders and the deep thud of presses shaping molten steel into the skeletons of automobiles. It was Sunday, a skeleton shift quieter than usual, until a crackling radio changed everything. We interrupt this program. Japanese planes have attacked Pearl Harbor. Wrenches stopped mid-turn. Sparks from welding torches hissed out like dying fireflies. Men and women mechanics, riveters, machinists turned toward the sound, frozen. Margaret Lewis, 23 years old, her hair tied up in a red bandana, stood near the tail end of the assembly line, a wrench in one hand and a half-assembled truck engine before her. Her younger brother had joined the Navy 6 months ago. The wrench slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the steel floor. No one spoke for a full minute. Then the foreman's voice broke the silence. "Turn that up." The radio static cleared, and President Roosevelt's words cut through the factory like the teeth of a saw, a date which will live in infamy. Someone muttered, "We're at war." Another whispered, "The men'll be drafted." But Margaret didn't move. She just stared at the half-built engine and thought, if they go fight, someone's got to build what they'll fight with. 3 days later, the world inside River Rouge changed forever. The signs went up, now hiring women encouraged to apply. By the spring of 1942, entire sections of the factory floor were filled with new faces. Housewives, teachers, secretaries, all learning how to shape steel. Women who had never touched a wrench were now riveting fuselages, welding tank hulls and assembling engines for planes that would soon darken the skies over Europe and the Pacific. Margaret was one of the first to be transferred to the new Willow Run plant in Ypsilanti Ford's experimental facility dedicated to building the B-24 Liberator bomber. It was a gamble that even Henry Ford had called insane, one bomber every hour. But to Margaret and the thousands like her, it wasn't insanity, it was purpose. February 1942. Willow Run construction site. The building was the largest in the world, under one roof, a mile long, its floors gleaming like rivers of steel. Trucks hauled in machinery crates and metal frameworks. The smell of cutting oil and hot tar filled the air. Outside, snow melted under the heat of blowtorches as the factory's skeleton took shape. Margaret arrived by bus, clutching her lunch pail and a worker's badge that read Riveter Section 12B. She stared at the cavernous space before her, hundreds of stations, cranes suspended like giant insects, and a noise so loud it felt alive. "Looks like a city," said the woman beside her. "A city that builds wings. By summer it would be running day and night." Across the Atlantic, Colonel Heinrich von Albrecht, a logistics officer stationed at Koblenz, Germany, stared at a new report from the Abwehr Intelligence Bureau. It listed U.S. industrial output projections, tanks, bombers, rifles, ships. He laughed. "These numbers are ridiculous," he told his adjutant. "No country can build like this. Half their men will be in uniform. Who will man the factories?" "Housewives," his aide shrugged. "The Americans have no understanding of war economy." Von Albrecht folded the report and tossed it aside. "Then we have nothing to worry about." He was wrong. By mid-1943, more than 6 million women had entered the American workforce. Posters went up in every city, "We can do it, join the women behind the men." The image of Rosie the Riveter flexing her arm bandana bright against the blue backdrop became a symbol that replaced fear with determination. At Willow Run, Margaret worked 10-hour shifts 7 days a week. Her fingers blistered, her arms ached, and her hair smelled constantly of oil and ozone. But every time she looked up and saw a B-24's fuselage rolling down the line, she felt something new: pride. Each bomber took 1.25 million parts, and by 1944, Willow Run was producing one every 63 minutes. At night, she'd stand outside with the other women wiping the sweat from her neck as another Liberator roared skyward for its test flight. Its engines, 4 Pratt & Whitney R-1830 twin Wasps, thundered against the horizon. Someone would always whisper, "That one'll be over Berlin soon." Meanwhile, in Berlin, Minister of Armaments Albert Speer received an intelligence summary from occupied France. American production rate of heavy bombers exceeds 8,000 per month. He read it twice, his jaw tightening. When he brought the report to the German High Command, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel scoffed. Propaganda. No nation can produce that many aircraft. Speer's voice was quiet but firm. They can. They have women working the assembly lines. Silence followed. One general finally muttered, "Women preposterous." But deep down, Speer knew the truth. Germany's factories, crippled by Allied bombing and strict labor policies, could not keep up. The Reich had conscripted its men, enslaved foreign workers, and still the machines stood idle for lack of parts. In America, the machines never stopped. At Willow Run, Margaret's team had nicknames for every bomber that rolled out the doors: Victory Bell, Detroit, Dream Lady, Liberty. She'd scratch the names into the metal before painting the rivets. Sometimes she'd imagine her brother, somewhere in the Pacific, looking up at one of those planes, maybe even flying in one. When the whistle blew at midnight, the women filed out in lines, grease-streaked, exhausted faces, lit by the orange glow of the furnaces. Buses carried them home through the snow. Some fell asleep against the windows, still wearing their gloves. They were tired, but America was awake. By 1944, the numbers defied imagination. 300,000 aircraft, 88,000 tanks, 2.4 million trucks, 6,000 Liberty ships, ammunition shells and rifles by the billions. Factories in Detroit, Seattle, and Pittsburgh roared day and night. The sound of war, not gunfire, but machinery, thundered from one ocean to the other. And at the center of it all were women like Margaret Lewis, unarmed, untrained, but unstoppable. In Berlin, the once proud officers of the Wehrmacht stared at the reports piling on Speer's desk. America's industrial production has tripled. Entire divisions are being re-equipped in weeks, one said, his voice cracking. Von Albrecht remembered his own words from 2 years earlier. Who will man the factories? Housewives. He didn't laugh this time. He looked at a photograph smuggled from France, a propaganda poster pinned to a wall, a woman with her sleeve rolled up, flexing her arm beneath bold letters, "We can do it." The colonel whispered, "Mein Gott." They did. The war in Europe was already tilting. The Americans weren't just fighting with soldiers, they were fighting with workers. Every rivet, every welded plate, every engine was another bullet in the industrial barrage that Germany could no longer withstand. Margaret didn't know it, but each spark that flew from her welder's torch was part of a battle as decisive as Normandy or Stalingrad. In the glow of the factory lights, she and millions like her were reshaping the world one rivet at a time. The snow in Washington fell heavy that winter, silent, blanketing the steps of the Capitol and the marble facade of the War Production Board. Inside, the atmosphere was anything but quiet. Every desk buzzed with teletypes, clattering typewriters, and the low hum of urgency that came when a nation realized it was no longer preparing for war, it was in one. At a long oak table, Donald Nelson, head of the War Production Board, spread blueprints across a map of the continental United States. His finger tapped at Detroit. "This city is no longer the Motor City," he said. "It's the arsenal of democracy." Behind him, charts showed what was about to happen, a conversion so vast that even economists doubted it was possible. Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, Packard, and Buick, the titans of the automobile industry, were being retooled for war. Passenger car lines shut down. Civilian sales banned. Every plant ordered to produce engines, guns, tanks, or planes. Nelson's words were cold and final. No more sedans. No more convertibles. Detroit builds weapons now. Meanwhile, Willow Run, Michigan. The new plant was alive. 100,000 workers surged through its gates each day, a human river flowing into a machine that never slept. The sound was thunderous rivet guns hammering in rhythm cranes, screeching engines roaring to life as test stands ran night and day. Margaret Lewis had been promoted to section lead on the tail assembly line. Her team of 12 all-women could now complete an entire rear fuselage in under 4 hours. They'd learned efficiency through repetition, their hands moving faster than words. She looked up as the whistle blew and shouted over the din. "All right, girls, Section 12, load the frame. Let's show the men how it's done." Laughter followed, mixed with pride. They knew the nickname the press had given them, the Women of Willow Run. It stuck like a medal. At night, the plant lights glowed so bright they could be seen for miles. Farmers joked they could read their newspapers by the glare. But in truth, that light had become a kind of beacon, the heartbeat of America's war effort pulsing out into the dark. On the other side of the Atlantic, the same glow appeared, but it was fire. March 1942. Essen, Germany. The industrial city home to the Krupp Armaments Works was under blackout. Searchlights cut through the fog as anti-aircraft guns barked at British bombers overhead. In a command post beneath the factory, Colonel Heinrich von Albrecht met with engineers and foremen. Their faces were gray with fatigue. The Allies had struck again, crippling another section of the plant. "We'll have it rebuilt within a week," one engineer promised. Von Albrecht slammed a hand on the table. "A week? We don't have a week. Our army on the Eastern Front burns through 10,000 shells a day, and Berlin keeps asking why American trucks outnumber ours 10 to 1. He grabbed a telegram from his desk, reading aloud, "United States, to exceed 48,000 aircraft this year." He paused. 48,000. How? No one answered. The walls shook from a distant explosion, dust drifting down from the ceiling. Von Albrecht clenched his jaw. Somewhere across the ocean, there were factories running 24 hours a day, untouched by bombers, powered by resources Germany could only dream of. And worst of all, they were staffed by women. Back in Detroit, a new worker arrived at the assembly floor, Lydia Ramos, 19, daughter of a Mexican railroad laborer. She had never seen a machine shop before, but within a week she could operate a drill press with precision down to a millimeter. Margaret took her under her wing. "You'll get blisters at first," she said, handing her gloves, "then calluses, then pride." They worked side by side through the long winter nights. The smell of oil clung to everything, and the noise was constant, deafening, relentless, rhythmic. Yet there was something almost musical in it. A chorus of labor fueled by purpose. Every shift change, loudspeakers blared swing music from Glenn Miller or Benny Goodman. The women danced for a few minutes before returning to the line. Laughter echoed through the hangar, bright, defiant, human. In those same months, Washington's planners faced the impossible math of global war. To defeat the Axis, America would have to outproduce not one enemy, but 3, Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. By spring 1942, the War Production Board's projections were staggering: 125,000 aircraft, 75,000 tanks, 35,000 landing craft, 8 million tons of merchant shipping. Factories like Willow Run Bethlehem Steel and the Kaiser shipyards would have to achieve what no industrial civilization had ever done before: build faster than the enemy could destroy. To achieve it, they needed labor, endless, tireless labor. That meant women. Recruitment drives swept the nation. Posters appeared on street corners: "Do the job. He left behind. Join the women's army of industry. If you can drive a nail, you can build a plane." By June 1942, more than 2 million women had already joined the workforce. By 1943, that number would triple. Margaret noticed the change every day. At first, the men had grumbled, "Women can't handle machine work." Then they'd watched the production charts climb and the arguments stopped. Now entire sections of the line were run by women. Foremen saluted them, half-jokingly. Commanders from the Army Air Forces toured the plant, shaking hands and taking photographs for the papers. "Another B-24 every hour," one general remarked. "Hitler won't believe this until it's falling on his head." And he didn't. In Berlin, von Albrecht attended a meeting with Armaments Minister Speer, who stared grimly at an American intelligence report. "New bomber plant in Michigan, producing at rate of 1 aircraft per hour, Speer read aloud. Confirmed by reconnaissance photography. A general scoffed. 1 per hour. That's fantasy. Speer shook his head. No, gentlemen. It's not fantasy. It's assembly line logic. The Americans have turned war into mass production. Von Albrecht said nothing. He thought of the women in those photographs, smiling, sleeves rolled up, surrounded by engines larger than their bodies. He couldn't explain it. But something in that image, the strength, the confidence, unsettled him more than any weapon ever could. By the end of 1942, Willow Run alone employed over 40,000 people, half of them women. The plant produced 1/3 of all B-24 bombers ever built. At the height of its output, it assembled an aircraft every 55 minutes. Margaret would watch the newest bomber roll past her section, its wings catching the light, its engines gleaming like polished thunder. She'd press a hand against the metal, whispering under her breath, "Fly safe." She didn't know that the rhythm of her factory, the constant hum, the endless motion was echoing across an ocean, shaking the confidence of men who had once believed themselves invincible. The Michigan summer arrived thick and humid, the kind of heat that made the factory air shimmer above the concrete floors. Inside Willow Run, the sound was deafening, a wall of clanging steel, hissing welds, and the endless rattle of rivet guns echoing through a building longer than 16 football fields. Margaret Lewis wiped the sweat from her brow, the red bandana on her head streaked with grease. She was halfway through a 12-hour shift, crouched over a section of the B-24's left wing. The air was alive with motion, cranes swinging overhead, forklifts humming past, voices shouting above the din. "Rivet 478 tight and flush," she called to Lydia Ramos, her partner at the gun. Lydia steadied the steel plate and nodded. "Ready when you are, boss." The two women worked in rhythm, the thunk-thunk of the rivet gun, syncing with the beat of jazz leaking faintly from a distant loudspeaker. Margaret pressed the trigger. Sparks scattered like fireflies across the aluminum. Down the line, a supervisor walked past, clipboard in hand, checking measurements with military precision. "Luis Ramos, good work. Keep that section moving. We've got 3 more birds rolling out tonight." Margaret flashed a quick salute with her wrench. "Roger that." For her, the language of the factory had become the language of war, targets, sections, production quotas, deadlines. They weren't just building airplanes. They were fighting back one rivet at a time. In those same weeks across Germany, Colonel Heinrich von Albrecht stood beneath a bombed-out gantry at the Ruhr Valley's Essen complex, the heart of the Reich's war industry. The sky was black with soot. The air stank of burnt oil. British bombers had hit the Krupp factories again, and the once mighty industrial engine of the Wehrmacht groaned under the strain. A worker stumbled up to him, face gray with fatigue. "Herr Oberst, we can't keep up. Replacement parts are gone, the laborers are sick. We need time." Von Albrecht's jaw tightened. "There is no time. Berlin demands replacements for the tanks lost in Kharkov. We deliver or we die." He turned away, his boots crunching glass beneath him. He'd read the latest American production figures the night before. In 3 months, they had built more aircraft than Germany had managed in a year. And now there were rumors, absurd rumors, that women were building them. Women. In his mind, he pictured frail secretaries and housewives fumbling with wrenches. The idea was laughable, and yet somehow the numbers kept climbing. Back in Michigan, Margaret and her crew finished the wing section just before dawn. The night shift clocked out, but she stayed behind to watch the final assembly. Under the glow of industrial lamps, the B-24 Liberator took shape, a beast of aluminum and steel, stretching 75 feet from nose to tail. Men and women swarmed around it like ants, tightening bolts, checking hydraulics, painting insignia. By sunrise, the aircraft was ready. Margaret joined the crowd gathered on the tarmac as the test pilot climbed into the cockpit. The engines, 4 massive Pratt & Whitney R-1830 twin Wasps, roared to life, the sound vibrating through her bones. The bomber rolled forward slow at first, then faster. Dust kicked up from its wheels as it rose from the runway and climbed into the pale orange sky. The entire factory cheered. Margaret felt her throat tighten. "She flies," Lydia whispered beside her. "We built that." "No," Margaret said softly. "We built freedom." Word spread quickly through the industrial world. Reporters arrived, notebooks in hand, marveling at the sight of thousands of women working shoulder to shoulder, their hair tied in colorful bandanas, their arms streaked with oil and sweat. One reporter from Life magazine snapped a photo of Margaret's section, a candid moment of her and Lydia laughing over a stack of aluminum panels. The caption would read, "The women who build wings." A week later, that photo appeared on newsstands across America. Margaret's mother mailed her the issue with a note. "I'm proud of you, Rosie." The name made her smile. It wasn't hers alone. It belonged to all of them now, the Rosies, the women who kept the furnaces burning while the men fought across oceans. At night, after her shift, Margaret would walk home past the railway yard. Freight trains thundered by, loaded with crates stamped U.S. Army Air Force's property. She'd stop and watch them vanish into the distance, knowing those parts were headed to England, to North Africa, to the Pacific. Sometimes she'd think of her brother's last letter mailed from a carrier somewhere near Guadalcanal, Cis. "They tell us the new planes are rolling off the lines faster than we can fly them. Keep building. You're saving lives out here." She kept that letter folded in her pocket, the ink smudged from oil and sweat. By the end of 1942, the numbers were staggering. Over 2 million women in industrial labor, 1 million in the aircraft industry alone. Shipyards, producing Liberty ships in less than a week, one famously built in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. Detroit had become an organism of its own, a machine with a pulse. The sound of factory whistles replaced church bells. The shift change was the new heartbeat of the nation. Across the ocean, Germany's pulse was faltering. In Berlin, Albert Speer pored over the Allied economic data captured by intelligence officers. The Reich was producing roughly 39,000 aircraft per year. America was approaching 100,000. He stared at the charts, exponential curves climbing higher every month, and rubbed his temples. "It's not just their machines," he murmured to von Albrecht. "It's their society. They've mobilized everything." Von Albrecht frowned. "You mean the women?" Speer nodded. "Yes, they've weaponized work." By autumn, the first whispers of defeat reached even the Wehrmacht's command corridors. Von Albrecht received another report, photographs of American factories taken by spies in Mexico. The images showed women by the thousands working lathes, welding wings, and assembling tank engines. He studied one photo for a long time, a woman with a red scarf holding a rivet gun, smiling. It was absurd. It was impossible. And yet somehow he thought she was more dangerous to Germany than any general on the battlefield. At Willow Run, Margaret's section received its 1,000th bomber badge. They celebrated with coffee and donuts gathered around the painted nose of the aircraft Lucky Lady. Someone brought a radio. Glenn Miller's "In the Mood" played as they danced on the factory floor, laughter echoing off the steel rafters. For a moment, the war felt far away. But outside, trains were already loading the next shipment of bombers. The line never stopped. The sound of hammers, the rhythm of rivets. It was the drumbeat of democracy echoing across oceans. And soon, even the German generals would have to admit it. The women of America had become the most formidable industrial army the world had ever seen. The nation was molten. Steel poured like rivers, sparks raining over foundry floors that glowed as bright as battlefields. The furnaces of Pittsburgh, the shipyards of Mobile, the aircraft plants of Seattle, every corner of America pulsed with one rhythm: production. The radio no longer spoke of unemployment or depression. It spoke of quotas, contracts, delivery schedules. By the dawn of 1943, the United States had become something new. A war machine powered not by conquest, but by labor. And the engine of that machine was no longer only men. It was the hands of 6 million women, steady and relentless, shaping the weapons that would end tyranny. Margaret Lewis woke at 4:30 every morning. The alarm clock buzzed like a drill. Her fingers were sore from yesterday's shift, her nails blackened with oil. She tied her bandana, kissed the photo of her brother taped to the mirror, and stepped into the cold. The factory bus smelled of metal coffee and exhaustion. Rows of women sat shoulder to shoulder, half asleep, their lunch pails clanking with every turn. Outside, snow drifted through the dawn, but the horizon already glowed Willow Run's lights burning day and night. Inside the plant, the heat hit like a wall. The thunder of presses, the shriek of welds, the hiss of steam. The foreman shouted over the noise. Section 12, ramp up. We've got a new quota from Washington, 10% increase. Lydia Ramos rolled her shoulders and grinned. Guess they think we're superwomen. Margaret smirked, fitting her gloves. Then let's prove them right. Across the country, other women were proving it too. In Seattle, crews at the Boeing Plant 2 worked around the clock, producing B-17 flying fortresses, 4-engine bombers that would soon thunder across Europe. Rows of women's sleeves rolled up crawled through the narrow fuselage sections wiring circuits and installing gun mounts. At Bethlehem Steel in Pennsylvania, female crane operators swung 20-ton girders over the heads of welders as sparks cascaded like fireworks. Move, honey, one shouted, steering the massive hook with the grace of a dancer. In Mobile, Alabama, the Alabama Dry Dock and Shipbuilding Company saw its first integrated workforce, black and white women, working side by side to assemble Liberty ships under the Gulf's blazing sun. The old barriers of gender and race began to bend beneath the weight of necessity. A reporter visiting the site wrote, "They build with the calm of surgeons and the courage of soldiers." Meanwhile, in Berlin, the tone of reports from the German High Command grew increasingly anxious. Colonel Heinrich von Albrecht sat in his office at the Ministry of Armaments, staring at a new intelligence briefing from neutral Switzerland. American shipyards launch vessels faster than they can be named. One yard completed a Liberty ship in 4 days. Von Albrecht scowled. 4 days impossible. Speer set the paper down. Not impossible. Organized. The Americans treat war as an engineering problem, not a crusade. And they have turned their women into an army of engineers. Von Albrecht rubbed his temples. We draft hours for nursing and typewriters. They build ships. The room fell silent. Outside, the sirens began to wail another Allied air raid incoming. Speer sighed. We fight under the bombs. They fight under electric light. At Willow Run, electric light never dimmed. The plant ran 3 shifts, 24 hours a day. Margaret's section now built nose assemblies, the sharp aluminum faces of the B-24s. Precision work, every rivet had to align perfectly with the frame. A single flaw could tear a bomber apart mid-flight. Measure twice, Margaret reminded her crew, voice firm over the roar. Then rivet-like lives depend on it because they do. The women nodded, moving in seamless rhythm. The sound of the rivet gun was almost like a heartbeat, now constant and unbroken. At lunch, Lydia handed her a sandwich. You ever wonder what they think over there, the Germans, I mean? Margaret shrugged. I hope they're scared. They should be, Lydia said. They've never fought women before. By spring 1943, production reached levels that stunned even Washington. 65,000 aircraft, 45,000 tanks, 5 million rifles and carbines, 3 million tons of bombs. The American economy had doubled in size since Pearl Harbor. President Roosevelt called it the miracle of production. But it wasn't a miracle. It was mathematics, 16-hour days, 7-day weeks, and millions of women who refused to slow down. Factories became cities. Cafeterias, nurseries, even beauty salons operated inside plants. Daycare centers allowed mothers to work through the night, children asleep in rows of cribs, while overhead cranes carried the wings of bombers toward completion. War had consumed everything, even sleep. On the other side of the Atlantic, the Ruhr Valley burned nightly under Allied bombs. The German war machine, deprived of raw materials and fuel, sputtered. Von Albrecht visited the front near Aachen to inspect a division's logistics. He found tanks immobilized, waiting for replacement parts that would never arrive. A captain saluted wearily. "Sir, we've requested new transmissions for months. Berlin says the factories are behind." Von Albrecht nodded grimly. He knew why. German plants already under constant bombardment had no workforce left. Young men were at the front, older men dead or wounded, and women, the untapped labor force of the Reich, were still forbidden from heavy industrial work by Nazi policy. Across the ocean, American women were building tanks faster than Germany could destroy them. Von Albrecht stared at the ruined road and muttered, "We're losing to ghosts, women we never thought existed." By the summer of 1943, Margaret's team had surpassed every quota. A brass plaque was mounted above their line section 12B, fastest output in plant history. The women celebrated with coffee and cake music blasting from a borrowed phonograph. Someone painted a slogan on the wall in red letters, "Hitler says women belong in the kitchen, we're cooking his goose instead." They laughed until tears rolled down their faces. Then when the whistle blew, they went right back to work. Every shift ended the same way, the last plane rolling out under floodlights, the line quiet for a moment, the smell of oil hanging in the air. Margaret would stand there, hand on the fuselage, feeling the vibration of the engines as they came to life. That vibration was the pulse of the nation, an invisible connection stretching across continents, across oceans, to the soldiers fighting under foreign skies. And even though she couldn't see it, she knew somewhere a German general was reading another report, another chart, and wondering how a nation of secretaries and homemakers had turned into the most efficient armory in human history. The sun rose over the Richmond shipyards like molten steel. Dock cranes loomed against the fog, and the bay thundered with the rhythm of hammers. Sparks rained from scaffolds as welders traced glowing seams along the hull of yet another Liberty ship. At slipway number 3, Clara Mitchell, 28, adjusted her welding hood and squinted through the flame. The metal hissed beneath her torch, smoke curling upward in gray ribbons. Around her, hundreds of women worked shoulder to shoulder, welders, painters, pipe fitters. A siren blared overhead. It wasn't an air raid. It was a celebration. "Ship 538 ready for launch," shouted a foreman. A cheer rolled across the yard. Chains groaned as the massive vessel slid toward the water. Men and women waved flags, shouting as the ship kissed the surface and surged forward. Clara lifted her mask and grinned, her face streaked with soot. "That's number 12 this month," she said proudly. 12 ships. We're breaking records." Her friend beside her laughed. "And they said we couldn't build one." By autumn 1943, America had become a continent of factories and shipyards. The Kaiser yards in California alone employed 93,000 workers, half of them women. They were building ships faster than the Axis could sink them. Each Liberty ship required 250,000 parts and 500,000 rivets, yet crews were turning them out in less than 2 weeks. In one legendary case, the SS Robert E. Peary workers completed an entire ship in 4 days and 15 hours. Newsreels played the footage nationwide, women with bandanas and welding masks waving as the ship slid into the bay. The headline read, "Speed Beats U-Boats." Margaret Lewis saw that film on her day off. Sitting in the dark of the theater, popcorn untouched, she felt a lump rise in her throat. It was strange she'd never been near a shipyard, but those women felt like comrades. On the screen, a narrator's voice boomed, "They build the bridges across oceans, these women of steel. Their hammers echo across the world." Margaret thought of her brother's letters, of the planes she built, of the men they carried. "Bridges across oceans," she repeated silently. That night she went back to the factory an hour early. She didn't want to waste a single minute. Across the Atlantic, the German war economy was collapsing under its own weight. Colonel Heinrich von Albrecht stood inside a bunker outside Berlin, watching Speer pace before a map dotted with red pins. Each red mark, Speer said, represents a factory destroyed or disabled by bombing. Hamburg, Kassel, Bremen, all reduced to rubble. Output has fallen by 30%. Von Albrecht scanned the latest intercepted figures. And the Americans. Speer's voice was flat. Their output has increased by 35. Silence filled the room. Outside, the muffled thunder of anti-aircraft guns echoed through the night. Von Albrecht finally spoke. "Herr Minister, we cannot compete." Speer turned sharply. "We must. The Führer refuses to hear the word impossible. He believes total war means total faith." Von Albrecht's eyes drifted toward a photograph lying on Speer's desk, one captured from Allied newspapers. It showed a woman with a welding mask raised, smiling at the camera. The caption read, "Rosie the Riveter, she's building victory." "She builds," Von Albrecht murmured, "while our factories burn." Speer didn't answer. Meanwhile, in Detroit, the Packard plant was a roaring furnace of invention. The assembly line no longer made luxury cars, it built Rolls-Royce Merlin engines under license for Allied aircraft. Rows of women engineers tested each unit, listening to the roar of 12 cylinders shaking the floor. At a test stand, Margaret's team calibrated the last of the week's run. The air shimmered with heat as the engines screamed at full throttle. "RPM stable at 2,700, shouted Lydia Ramos. "Pressure's good," Margaret called back. "Cut it." The engine wound down, metal ticking as it cooled. The supervisor, a veteran named Joe McAllister, nodded. "Perfect numbers, ladies. If I didn't know better, I'd say you were born with wrenches in your hands." Margaret smiled. "We just build faster when we're angry." Joe chuckled. "Then keep that fire burning. Berlin won't know what hit 'em." By winter, the home front had become a second battlefield. In Seattle, the Boeing plant produced the B-29 Superfortress, a machine so advanced that Japanese pilots couldn't reach its altitude. In Chicago, the laboratories of the Manhattan Project buzzed with quiet, unseen work that would soon redefine the meaning of power itself. In Ohio and New York, women chemists developed new alloys, explosives, and aviation fuels. Everywhere, the same pattern emerged. The more the war consumed, the more women stepped forward to replace what was lost. Factories that had once employed a handful of women now employed thousands. Cafeterias served 20,000 meals a day. On the walls hung signs that read, "The faster we build, the sooner they come home." Margaret would glance at that sign every morning, tapping it once like a superstition before heading to her station. It was a small ritual, but in a world of noise and repetition, it gave her purpose. In Berlin, that purpose was becoming the Reich's nightmare. Speer's reports to Hitler grew increasingly desperate. "Their women," he said in one meeting, "are not simply working, they are competing. They have turned patriotism into productivity." Hitler's face reddened. "Then conscript ours. If the Americans use women, so will we." But it was too late. German factories lacked the materials, the fuel, and the infrastructure. Entire cities lay in ruins, transport crippled, rail lines shattered. Even with women drafted into munitions work, the advantage was gone. Von Albrecht wrote in his diary that night, "We are being outbuilt, outplanned, outworked, and worst of all, outbelieved." At Willow Run, the final B-24 of the year rolled off the line number 8685. Margaret's crew gathered around for a photo. A journalist asked her, "What's it like knowing you've helped win the war from home?" Margaret hesitated. "It's not over yet," she said. "But when it is, I'll know we built the wings that carried them home." The flashbulb went off, capturing the grease on her cheek. The smile of pride, the bandana tied like armor. Somewhere in a dark office across the ocean, men in ironed uniforms would study photos like that and finally understand this was the enemy they'd underestimated. The one they'd never seen coming. The one made not of tanks and guns, but of faith, sweat, and steel. January 1944. Buffalo, New York. Snow fell in thick, wet flakes that clung to the smokestacks of the Curtiss Wright aircraft plant, but inside it was summer, a furnace of noise and heat. The air smelled of oil paint and human effort. Rows of workers moved in orchestrated precision, their tools clanging in rhythm with the heartbeat of war. Among them was Sarah Kaplan, a machinist who had once been a schoolteacher. She leaned over a hydraulic press, guiding the steel housing of a P-40 Warhawk engine beneath the blade. The machine thundered, stamping metal into shape. Sarah exhaled and muttered one more heart for the sky. Above her workstation hung a sign, "Quality means lives." That phrase wasn't propaganda, it was literal truth. Every defect could cost a pilot his life. Every perfect fit meant another plane home. At Willow Run, the rhythm was the same, but louder, faster, more relentless. The factory had grown into a living organism, a mile of moving belts, cranes, sparks, and voices. Margaret Lewis stood on a catwalk overlooking the vast sea of machinery, clipboard in hand. Below her, thousands of workers, men and women, both swarmed around bomber fuselages under bright lamps that never dimmed. Her section was now responsible for final assembly inspection, the last line before flight testing. She'd earned the position not through rank, but through endurance, 2 years of 14-hour days, never missing a shift. The lines on her hands mirrored the rivet rows she'd built. "Pressure valves good," called Lydia Ramos, checking her gauge. "Hydraulics holding." Margaret nodded, scribbling notes. "All right, lock it up. Next one through." A foreman passing by stopped beside her. "You ever rest, Lewis?" Margaret smirked. "Not while the war's still running." He laughed. "Fair enough. They say Hitler's losing sleep because of you girls." "Good," she said. "Let him." Across the ocean, the man in question had indeed stopped sleeping. In the ruined corridors of Berlin's Reich Chancellery, Hitler paced while Albert Speer stood by with a thick folder of reports. "Our factories are running at 70% capacity," Speer began cautiously. "The Americans, however, have achieved full mobilization. They now outproduce the entire Axis by 4-1. Hitler waved a trembling hand. "Then we bomb them. Crush their industry," Speer hesitated. "Mein Führer, their industry cannot be bombed. It is too far, too vast. They build beyond the reach of our Luftwaffe." Hitler turned sharply, eyes wild. "And who builds these factories? Who builds their planes?" Speer's reply was simple, and to Hitler unthinkable. "Women." The room fell silent. In the Ruhr Valley, once Germany's industrial pride, the air raids came almost nightly now. Whole towns were erased. Bridges collapsed. Rail lines melted under the heat of incendiaries. Colonel Heinrich von Albrecht returned from a survey mission, his boots covered in soot. He had seen the Krupp foundries, or what was left of them. A handful of exhausted workers toiled amid the wreckage, shoveling slag by hand. Most were prisoners, French, Polish, Russian. There were no German women here, none building, none welding, none riveting. And that, he realized, was the difference. In America, women were making the steel. In Germany, they were mourning the men who once did. Von Albrecht sat on the edge of a shattered machine press, staring into the flames. He thought of the propaganda posters he'd seen years ago, Frauen gehören ins Heim. Women belong at home. He whispered bitterly, "And now our home is ash." Back in the United States, home had become the factory. Entire neighborhoods pulsed around industrial centers. Cafeterias ran through the night buses, ferried workers between shifts, and laundromats installed special factory hours. At Bethlehem Steel, children drew crayon pictures of tanks and bombers to pin above their mothers' workbenches. When a new factory opened in Chicago, the headline read, "Another front opens right here." Margaret read that line over breakfast and smiled. "They finally get it," she said to Lydia. "This isn't a job, it's a front line." Lydia nodded. "And our weapons don't jam." By spring 1944, the statistics had become absurd, a numerical avalanche that no one could quite comprehend. America's monthly output reached 8,000 aircraft, 650 tanks, 300,000 artillery shells per day, 2 Liberty ships every 24 hours. Factories no longer competed against quotas. They competed against themselves, setting records week after week. In Washington, the War Production Board calculated that each month of American labor now replaced an entire year of pre-war output. When reporters asked President Roosevelt how such a transformation was possible, he pointed to a poster of a woman rolling up her sleeve. Because she showed up, he said simply. At Willow Run, Margaret's shift ended near midnight. She and Lydia stood by the tarmac watching a freshly painted B-24J Liberator lift into the night. The engines thundered overhead, shaking the ground. Lydia whispered, "Do you ever wonder if the men flying them know who built them?" Margaret smiled faintly. "They don't have to. It's enough that they fly." The bomber's navigation lights blinked red and green as it vanished into the clouds. The wind carried the faint scent of oil and ozone. Somewhere far away, she thought that same smell must cling to the uniforms of the men in the air. And maybe, just maybe, they'd look down at the gleaming wings and realize this was what America looked like now. Aluminum courage and the strength of hands that refused to rest. In Berlin, the German High Command received a fresh report: enemy aircraft production outpaces losses by 9-to-1 ratio. Von Albrecht traced the line of figures with a pencil. He didn't need to be a mathematician to see what it meant. For every plane Germany destroyed, 9 more rose from American factories. He thought of the miles of assembly lines, of the endless rows of women hammering, welding, smiling. The sound of it haunted him. He closed the file and whispered to no one. "We are fighting against a nation that does not sleep." At Willow Run, Margaret and her crew returned for the next shift before sunrise. The cycle never stopped. The light inside the factory glowed golden against the dark sky, a sunrise made by electricity and determination. Somewhere in Europe, bombers were crossing the English Channel, dropping the same ordnance she'd built aimed at the cities where her unseen adversaries now hid underground. For the first time in the war, the battle for production was no longer a race. It was over. The outcome was decided not by soldiers, but by those who built their wings. June 6, 1944. The sound of rain and surf blended with the thunder of artillery on the beaches of Normandy. Allied troops stormed ashore, wading through chaos and fire. Ships lined the horizon. Bombers droned overhead like an endless storm. The invasion Operation Overlord had begun, thousands of miles away in the heart of Washington, D.C. President Franklin D. Roosevelt listened to the radio reports in silence. The voice of Edward R. Murrow crackled over the broadcast, "This is London. The Great Crusade has begun. The factories of America have come to France." Roosevelt smiled faintly at that phrase, "the factories of America," because he knew it was true. Every rifle, jeep, landing craft, and bomber on those beaches bore the fingerprints of home front labor, the sweat of millions who had never seen combat, but fought all the same. He turned to his aide and said, "If those men reach Paris, it will be because women in Detroit, Buffalo, and Seattle built the road for them." At Willow Run, the factory radio played the same broadcast. The women paused in their work, rivet guns still in hand. Silence rippled across the line. Margaret Lewis stood with her team eyes fixed on the loudspeaker. "They've landed," she whispered. Lydia Ramos crossed herself. "God help them." The foreman's voice broke the hush. "All right, you heard the news. That means we keep going. They're counting on us more than ever." The machines roared back to life. The noise was deafening, a chorus of resolve. Margaret gripped her drill and leaned into the metal tears cutting through the grime on her cheeks. Every turn of the rivet felt heavier, more urgent. This was their D-Day too, fought not with rifles, but with bolts and steel. Across the Atlantic, German officers listened to a very different broadcast. Inside a dim bunker near Cayenne, Colonel Heinrich von Albrecht huddled over a field radio as reports poured in. Enemy landing force estimated at 150,000. Paratroopers inland near Sainte-Mère-Église. Air superiority total. Von Albrecht rubbed his eyes. He had served through Poland, France, and Russia, but nothing had prepared him for this. "Where are they getting the material?" he muttered. "How can they move so much so fast?" A young aide handed him an intelligence briefing recovered from a downed C-47 transport. Inside were photographs, endless lines of aircraft, tanks, and vehicles waiting on English fields. the insignia of Ford Chrysler, Douglas Boeing. General Motors stenciled across crates and engines. Von Albrecht stared at the images, his voice hollow. They've turned their factories into fortresses. Back in Detroit, the factories were fortresses. The Chrysler Arsenal tank plant ran at full capacity, producing the M4 Sherman, the workhorse of the Allied advance. Over 50,000 units would roll off American lines before war's end. Each was assembled by hands that once built cars, washing machines, and stoves. Inside, the air smelled of oil and ozone. Engines thundered as they were tested. Women worked with sleeves rolled to the elbow, sparks painting their faces gold. One of them, Doris Hall, tightened a wrench on a transmission bolt and shouted over the roar. "Every tank we build means one less German to fight our boys," her friend laughed. "Then let's build 2 today." The rhythm of the line became its own kind of battle cry. Margaret's brother, Private First Class James Lewis, landed at Omaha Beach that morning. He was one of thousands who'd grown up in the shadow of the auto plants, now fighting with the weapons those same plants produced. Pinned behind a steel barrier, he watched a Sherman rumble past its treads, churning the sand. He slapped its side as it moved forward and shouted, "Go get 'em, Detroit!" The tank's turret fired the recoil, shaking the ground. Somewhere in that machine, bolts driven by his sister's hands held firm under the pressure. James would never know it, but that day his life depended on her precision. By nightfall, news reached home the landings had succeeded. The beaches were secure. Europe's liberation had begun. At Willow Run, the announcement came over the loudspeaker. The plant erupted in cheers. Some women cried, others danced. Margaret stood at her station, overwhelmed by the enormity of it all. Lydia handed her a cup of coffee. "You think this means the end's in sight?" Margaret shook her head. "Not yet. But it means we're closer. And that's enough." She looked down the vast line of aircraft fuselages gleaming under the lamps. "They'll need every one of these," she said quietly. "And we'll build them." Across the ocean, the contrast was brutal. In the Ruhr factories were silent ruins. Power plants, destroyed rail lines, twisted fuel depots empty. The Reich's proud industrial empire was dying, suffocated, under the weight of Allied bombers' aircraft, built by the very women Hitler had once mocked. Von Albrecht stood atop the rubble of an old steel mill and stared at the sky. A formation of B-17s droned overhead, glinting in the sun. The sound rolled like thunder across the valley. He whispered to himself, "Each of those bombers is a factory that learned to fly." In Washington, Roosevelt received a telegram from General Eisenhower. "Thanks to the industrial miracle of America, we have arrived in Europe in overwhelming strength. The enemy is astonished at the speed of our advance." Roosevelt smiled. "Overwhelming strength," he repeated softly. Then turning to his secretary, he said, "Send a message to the War Production Board. Tell them the women of America just opened the road to Berlin." That night, in a small apartment near Detroit, Margaret collapsed onto her bed, hands still trembling from the day's work. Her radio played softly Glenn Miller's American Patrol. She closed her eyes, picturing her brother somewhere in France, the tanks rolling, the bombers soaring. For the first time in years, she allowed herself a thought she had buried deep. "Maybe we can win this." She smiled faintly, grease still smudged on her cheek. Outside her window, the night sky glowed faintly orange from the factory lights, an artificial dawn that never faded even in darkness. It was the light of victory being built one rivet at a time. Artillery ratio 10. 1. He placed the sheet down. "They are drowning us in metal," he whispered. Spear's reply was quiet but resigned. "Metal and people. Their women work. Ours bury the dead." Von Albrecht looked out the window toward the skyline of Berlin, still standing but scarred. Smoke from recent bombings curled into the pale sky. He had served in Poland, Russia, North Africa, but never had he seen a war lost so completely without a single battle fought for it. It was being lost in the factories. Back in America, victory posters lined every wall, every shop, every street corner. She's the girl he left behind, keep her on the job. The more women at work, the sooner we win. But it wasn't just posters anymore. It was identity. The Rosie the Riveter song played on the radio daily. Newspaper headlines showed smiling women in goggles and overalls, their sleeves rolled up, their faces shining with sweat and pride. Margaret's factory received a visit from a film crew. A man with a camera climbed onto the catwalk and called out, "Ladies, smile for the newsreel. Let's show the boys overseas who's got their back." Lydia leaned toward Margaret, laughing. "You think they'll show this in Paris, baby?" Margaret said, smiling. "But even if they don't, we'll know." The camera panned across the line, thousands of women, the faces of America's Second Army. No guns, no medals, just determination. That same week in Normandy, General Eisenhower toured the front lines. Standing atop a captured German bunker, he watched the convoys stretch across the horizon. Trucks, tanks, fuel tankers, artillery pieces, all painted in the same dull olive green. He turned to his staff and said, "You realize what this means? We don't run out anymore. Of anything. Fuel, food, ammo, we have more than we can move." His logistics officer nodded. "Sir, our only problem is traffic." Eisenhower smiled. "That's the kind of problem I can live with." He looked at the sky where another formation of bombers droned overhead, their bellies glinting in the sun. "This isn't just strategy," he said. "It's the work of every woman back home who believed we could win." In Detroit, Margaret's brother's letter finally arrived. The envelope was mud-stained and creased, the ink faint but legible. She opened it with trembling hands. June 27, 1944. "Somewhere in France, sis. We've been moving every day since D-Day. The Shermans keep rolling. You wouldn't believe the roads, nothing but wreckage and dust. But those tanks of yours don't quit. You should see how they handle the hedgerows. They're beautiful machines. You built them right. When I see one pass, I think of you. Every rivet, every bolt, it's all part of home. Keep building. We'll keep fighting. Love, James." Margaret folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her breast pocket. For a moment she leaned against the fuselage beside her, eyes closed, listening to the hum of the assembly line. It sounded like a heartbeat. In Berlin, the heartbeat of industry had fallen silent. Fuel reserves dwindled. Trains stalled. Ammunition shipments failed to reach the front. German generals argued over logistics, while the Allies advanced from the west and the Soviets from the east. Von Albrecht stood in a bomb shelter with Speer as the lights flickered. The air smelled of dust and despair. "Do you hear that?" Speer asked. Von Albrecht frowned. "What? Nothing," Speer said softly. "That's the sound of defeat. Silence where there should be steel." The colonel said nothing. For the first time he understood that the war was not being lost by armies, but by the absence of sound in Germany and the relentless noise in America. Back at Willow Run, that relentless noise continued. Day after day, night after night. When the clock hit midnight, Margaret's section finished another Liberator. The line shut down for maintenance, but no one went home right away. They lingered smoking, laughing, sharing stories about the men overseas. Lydia strummed a guitar she'd brought, singing softly, "While the boys are away, we'll build till they're home." Margaret smiled, her eyes glassy from exhaustion. Keep singing, she whispered. If we stop making noise, the war stops too. Outside, the wind carried the hum of the generators across the sleeping city, a lullaby of power and perseverance. The arsenal of democracy didn't sleep. It dreamed in steel. The autumn rains turned France into mud. Convoys crawled along clogged roads, engines grinding treads, slipping. American GIs cursed and pushed and hauled, but even in the worst conditions, the war machine kept moving. Behind the front lines, the logistical miracle unfolded, a feat of mathematics and sweat that no general's strategy could match. The Red Ball Express, a convoy network operated largely by African-American drivers, ran 24 hours a day, hauling ammunition, fuel, and food from the Normandy beaches to the front lines in Germany. Each truck bore the same stencil on its side, made in USA. Each crate of fuel, each shell, each ration tin had begun in a factory often touched by the hands of a woman who would never see the battlefield. The Red Ball drivers joked that they could find Paris by following the smell of gasoline. But behind the laughter lay pride. They knew the truth: if they stopped for even a day, the advance would collapse. War had become an equation, and America's women were the variables that made it balance. In Washington, D.C., the War Production Board compiled its latest quarterly report. The numbers were staggering. Aircraft built since Pearl Harbor. 1,000 tanks produced 86,000 artillery pieces. Small arms and machine guns. 3 million. Rounds of ammunition, over 40 billion. A reporter reading the figures out loud in the press room whistled. That's not war production, that's creation. An analyst beside him replied, it's what happens when you give half a nation something to fight for. At the bottom of the report, a new statistic caught Roosevelt's attention. Women now make up 37% of the American industrial workforce. He underlined it twice and murmured, 37%. And they've built 100% of our future. In Detroit, the factories reflected that truth with every thunderous shift. At Chrysler's tank, Arsenal, sparks flew as women welders worked on M26 Pershings, the newest American heavy tank. The air inside the foundry shimmered with heat. Margaret Lewis, now a senior inspector, walked between the lines, clipboard in hand, checking armor plates with a magnet gauge. She'd traded her bandana for a helmet, her old fatigue shirt for a leather apron. Her crew greeted her with cheers. "Morning, boss," she smiled. "Morning. Let's make sure these babies roll." A woman named Anita, barely 19, shouted over the clang of hammers. "You hear the news? Paris is free." Margaret froze mid-step. "Say that again, Paris. They liberated it last week." The factory erupted. Someone shouted, "Play the radio," and within moments the loudspeakers blasted La Marseillaise across the plant. Women waved wrenches and danced, their faces glowing with tears and joy. For a moment, even the machines seemed to pause in reverence. Paris, the city of light, had been freed by the light of American industry. In Berlin, that light burned like a curse. Colonel Heinrich von Albrecht reviewed casualty and equipment loss reports. The figures were catastrophic. Entire panzer divisions were stranded for lack of fuel. Ammunition rations were cut by half. Tank factories lay in ruins. When he presented the data to Speer, the minister said nothing for a long time. Finally, he spoke quietly. "We are fighting a hydra. Cut off one head and 10 more appear. We bomb one plant, they build another across the ocean." Von Albrecht replied, "They build faster than we can kill." Speer looked down at his hands, streaked with soot from the latest inspection of the Berlin factories. "They have women who weld at night while their husbands fight by day. We have women who wait and pray." Tell me, Colonel, who do you think will win such a war? Von Albrecht didn't answer. He didn't need to. Back in the United States, the war felt close now. Everyone knew someone overseas. Every street had a blue star in a window. Some had gold. At Willow Run, the war bond posters grew more personal. One read, "Keep him flying, keep working." Another, in bold red letters, "Your rivets save lives." Margaret carried a folded newspaper in her pocket, the one with the front-page photo of the liberation of Paris. She looked at it during lunch, tracing the image of jubilant crowds and waving flags. Lydia Ramos sat beside her, unwrapping a sandwich. Hard to believe, huh? The same planes we built are flying over that city. Margaret nodded. We built their wings. Maybe next we'll build the peace. Autumn turned cold. The war dragged on into its final grinding phase. Germany was on the defensive, but it fought like a cornered animal. The Ardennes offensive loomed Hitler's last desperate gamble. At the Pentagon, planners debated how long the war might last. Eisenhower's staff estimated another year of heavy fighting, but the factories refused to slow down. Even as materials became scarce and exhaustion set in, production lines hummed without pause. Congress authorized new incentives, higher wages, victory bonuses, better rations. But most workers didn't need motivation anymore. They were beyond patriotism. They were bound by purpose. A reporter interviewing Margaret's team asked, "Aren't you tired?" Margaret smiled faintly. "Of course. But tired people end wars. Rested people lose them." In Berlin, von Albrecht stood beneath a sky that no longer knew silence. Allied bombers filled the air day and night. Their contrails crisscrossed above the city like white scars. He watched the smoke rising from the distance and thought of his brother killed on the Eastern Front and his sister still working in a sewing factory outside Dresden. The war had devoured them all, soldiers, civilians, even hope. He whispered to himself, "They say the Americans fight with machines. But it's not the machines that frighten me. It's the people who build them." At Willow Run, the shift bell rang. Thousands of women flooded out into the night air, the horizon glowing orange from the furnaces. Margaret stood outside, staring up at the stars. She couldn't see the war from here. Not the fields of France, not the ruins of Berlin, but she could feel it in her bones. Every explosion overseas, every victory, every loss, all of it vibrated through the steel she helped create. Lydia nudged her shoulder. "Come on, boss. You can't fight the war from the parking lot." Margaret smiled. "Can't I?" The two women laughed and disappeared into the fog, walking home beneath a sky lit not by bombs, but by the constant glow of industry, the heartbeat of a nation that refused to rest until the world was free. Snow blanketed the Ardennes like a shroud. The trees were silent beneath their burden of ice, and the muffled crunch of boots was the only sound in the forest until the thunder began. On December 16, 1944, Hitler launched his last desperate counteroffensive. Hundreds of German tanks and 500,000 men surged through the fog, smashing into Allied lines. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. In the freezing air above Bastogne, the sky was gray and unforgiving. American paratroopers, surrounded and outnumbered, fought with dwindling ammunition and no air support. Supplies ran thin. General Anthony McAuliffe of the 101st Airborne scrawled a single word in reply to a German surrender demand, "nuts." But defiance alone couldn't stop the panzers. What would save Bastogne and the entire Western Front was not courage, but logistics. Thousands of miles away, the women of America heard the news and understood what it meant. At Willow Run, the loudspeakers blared the latest update: heavy fighting reported in Belgium. Supply shortages critical, all shifts to double time until further notice. Margaret Lewis wiped her hands and shouted, "You heard him. Move like their lives depend on it, because they do." Her crew didn't hesitate. Machines whirred back to life, rivet guns hammering like artillery. Lydia Ramos handed her a wrench and grinned. "Think they'll hear us in Belgium?" Margaret smirked. "They'd better." In the cold night of December 22nd, convoys of C-47 Skytrains thundered down icy runways in England. Each aircraft loaded to the limit, with crates of ammunition, food, and fuel, much of it produced by women whose hands now trembled as they listened to the radio back home. The pilots flew through snowstorms, dodging flak, navigating blind. Some didn't make it, but most did, dropping their parachutes of hope over Bastogne. Each crate bore the stenciled letters USA. Each bullet inside bore the mark of a factory worker like Margaret or Sarah or Clara. For the men in Bastogne, those parachutes meant life. For the women back home, it meant proof that their labor had crossed oceans and saved lives in the snow. In Detroit, factories burned with light, despite the blackout curtains drawn over every window. The cold seeped through the walls, but the women barely noticed. The foreman at the Packard plant stood on a crate and shouted, "They need engines! They need them now, Sarah Kaplan!" The former schoolteacher turned machinist shouted back, "Then let's teach them how America fights!" The floor roared with laughter, and work resumed faster, louder, hotter. The rhythmic pounding of steel drowned out exhaustion. When the shift finally ended near dawn, no one left. They slept against the walls, the machines still humming beside them. Meanwhile, in Berlin, the news struck like a hammer. Colonel Heinrich von Albrecht entered the war room where Albert Speer and other ministers gathered around a map of the Ardennes. At first, there was excitement. The offensive was working. Allied lines had bent. But then came the next report: enemy air forces re-established within 48 hours. Supply reserves replenished. Counterattacks underway. Von Albrecht set the paper down, stunned. Impossible. Their supply lines should have collapsed. Speer rubbed his eyes. "They don't collapse, Colonel. They multiply. Their factories are storms that never stop." He glanced toward the snow-covered city outside. "We are fighting the weather itself, a blizzard of industry." As the Ardennes offensive ground to a halt, the reality set in. The German war machine had exhausted itself. Tanks sat immobile out of fuel. Soldiers marched on foot through the snow, scavenging for food. Captured officers admitted in disbelief the Americans fight like a river. You can push it, but it always flows back. That river began in the factories, in the welding torches, the presses, the furnaces. At Willow Run, the women waited anxiously for news. When the headline finally came, "Bastogne relieved," the plant erupted in cheers. Margaret leaned against a crate, tears streaking her face, her hands still black with grease. "They held," she whispered. Lydia clapped her on the shoulder. "So did we." Margaret smiled through her exhaustion. "Guess we're all soldiers now." Winter dragged on. Fuel rations tightened, snow piled high against the factory doors, but the women refused to slow down. Posters appeared in every corridor. "The boys in the bulge need you, don't let them down." Margaret carried one in her lunch pail, folded neatly beside her brother's letter. When she felt her strength fading, she'd take it out, read it, and return to the line. Each rivet she drove, each wing she inspected, felt personal now, like whispering a prayer for a soldier she would never meet. In Berlin, von Albrecht stood once more before Speer. The offensive had failed. The generals were silent. The map of Europe was bleeding red arrows pointing toward Germany. Speer closed his folder and said softly, "It is finished." Von Albrecht nodded, weary beyond words. "Not yet. They will come for Berlin next." Speer sighed. "And what will we fight them with, Colonel? We have no tanks, no fuel, no steel. Only rubble and ghosts." He paused, then added bitterly, "And against us they have women who can build an army from nothing." Back in America, the war felt endless, but victory was finally visible on the horizon. The newspapers spoke of crossing the Rhine, of the fall of the Siegfried Line, of the Allies entering Germany. Margaret's crew didn't celebrate. Not yet. They worked as if the war would never end, because until every soldier came home, it hadn't. On one of the walls, someone had painted in bold letters, "We'll rest when they do." It became their oath. The night shift took their places, the machinery rumbled to life, and across the dark fields of Michigan, the factory lights burned against the winter snow, a second sunrise for a world still clawing its way out of darkness. The bridge at Remagen shook like thunder. Shells burst along the riverbanks, smoke rising in black columns as German artillery tried desperately to destroy the crossing. It was March 7th, 1945, and the Americans had done the impossible. They had captured the Ludendorff Bridge over the Rhine intact. Men of the 9th Armored Division sprinted across the steel span under fire, laying planks, clearing mines, shouting orders over the roar. The Rhine, Germany's last great natural barrier, had been breached. General Omar Bradley radioed Eisenhower, "We're across." The reply came minutes later from SHAEF headquarters. "Well done. Tell them to keep going." And they did, tanks, trucks, and infantry pouring across the bridge like a living tide. The sound of treads on steel echoed down the river valley, the same rhythm that pulsed inside the factories thousands of miles away. In Washington, the War Production Board received the telegram and broke into applause. It wasn't just a military victory, it was the triumph of logistics. For every tank that crossed the Rhine, for every jeep that rolled down the Autobahn, there was a blueprint, a rivet, a hand that had placed a bolt, tightened a valve, or sealed a crate. Behind that bridge stood the invisible bridge of American industry, millions of workers, 6 million women, and a network of factories so vast that even the generals couldn't comprehend it. When the news hit the airwaves, President Roosevelt read the report with a faint smile. "We crossed the Rhine," he murmured, "and every woman with a rivet gun crossed it with us." In Detroit, the announcement came through the loudspeakers mid-shift. Margaret Lewis froze mid-step as the foreman's voice boomed, "The boys are across the Rhine." The factory erupted in cheers. Hammers banged on steel, voices rose in joy, and someone unfurled a faded American flag above the line. The machines kept running louder than ever, as if celebrating. Lydia Ramos wiped her eyes. "Think your brother's there," Margaret nodded slowly. "If he is, then every plane we built is flying cover over him right now." Meanwhile, in Berlin, Colonel Heinrich von Albrecht stood in the ruins of the once proud capital, listening to the thunder of Allied bombers overhead. He had stopped reading production reports weeks ago. There was no point. Germany was no longer producing. It was surviving hour by hour, raid by raid. Every night the city shook as factories, depots, and rail yards vanished in flames. A soldier entered, saluting stiffly. "Herr Oberst, we've lost the Ruhr." Von Albrecht didn't respond at first. Then quietly, he said, "Then we've lost everything." He turned toward the window where the sky pulsed orange from distant fires. "They've beaten us with factories," he whispered, "and faith." At Willow Run, that same faith burned bright. The women worked faster than ever, even though the end now seemed inevitable. They knew victory was near, but they also knew how much it had cost: the fatigue, the injuries, the letters that never came back. Margaret kept her brother's last letter in her pocket, the edges worn soft from handling. She didn't talk about it much. No one did. Everyone had someone they were building for. The foreman, Joe McAllister, shouted across the floor, All right, ladies. Command says we're ahead of schedule. They want more B-24s ready for the Pacific. Lydia groaned. You mean we don't get a break after Berlin? Margaret smiled faintly. Not until the last shots fired. The women cheered and went back to work. In Remagen, the bridge finally collapsed under the weight of weeks of shell fire and stress. But by then, it didn't matter. The Allies had already crossed in force. The Rhine, the symbol of Germany's invincibility, was now an American highway. Eisenhower stood on the west bank watching the flow of trucks and tanks and turned to his aide. You know what this means? The young officer shook his head. It means, Eisenhower said quietly, the women back home just won the war for us. By April, Germany was collapsing from within. Cities surrendered without orders. Railways lay in ruins. Supply depots burned themselves out. Von Albrecht walked through the streets of Berlin past women hauling buckets of water through rubble. Once he might have believed in the empire they were dying for. Now he only felt shame. He stopped before the charred remains of a propaganda poster, a woman smiling in an apron under the slogan, "The kitchen is her front." He tore it down and threw it into the gutter. No, he muttered. The front was in Detroit. Across the ocean, in the candlelit church in Michigan, Margaret and other factory workers gathered for a memorial. The pastor read the names of those lost. Each name echoed like a hammer strike. When he finished, Margaret rose quietly and spoke, her voice trembling but clear. We built the planes they flew and the tanks they drove, and for every one that didn't come home, we'll keep building until no one else has to leave. Silence filled the church, broken only by the hum of a train passing in the distance. Another shipment bound for the front. Another whisper of the endless engine that had carried a nation across the ocean. That night, Margaret stood outside the factory alone. The sky glowed faintly from the furnaces, red against the dark. She closed her eyes, listening to the hum of the machines and the faint whistle of the wind through the open hangar doors. It sounded like breathing steady, alive, unstoppable. For the first time, she realized the truth: America hadn't just built weapons. It had built momentum, a force that no empire, no ideology, no dictator could ever outlast. And the heart of that momentum was beating right here in the hands of women who never asked for glory, only the chance to do their part. April 30th, 1945, Berlin. The bunker smelled of damp concrete and smoke. Outside, the guns never stopped. The Soviets were closing in house by house, street by street. The once great capital of the Reich had become a tomb. In the flickering light of an oil lamp, Colonel Heinrich von Albrecht sat at a wooden desk, writing his final report. His pen scratched across the paper, the words deliberate and slow. The enemy's strength lay not in men nor in machines, but in endurance. They have outlasted us in every sense, in production, in will, in imagination. We fought soldiers. They forged citizens. He set the pen down. In the silence that followed, he could hear the distant rumble of tanks, American, Soviet. It no longer mattered. He stood, buttoned his coat, and looked around the room one last time. Maps, radios, files, relics of a war already lost. On the table sat a single captured leaflet dropped by Allied bombers weeks earlier. A woman's face smiled from the paper sleeve, rolled up arm flexed. The caption read, "We can do it." Von Albrecht stared at it, the faintest hint of a smile crossing his face. "Yes," he whispered, "you did." May 8th, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The bells began at dawn. From London to Paris to New York, they rang without pause. Crowds flooded the streets. Flags unfurled from windows. Confetti drifted like snow through the avenues. In Washington, D.C., President Harry S. Truman stood before the cameras, his voice calm but firm. The victory belongs to the men who fought it, but also to those who built it. He paused, glancing at a sheet of paper in his hand, a final production report. By the end of this war, American factories produced over 300,000 aircraft, 88,000 tanks, and 40 billion rounds of ammunition. And 6 million women, our daughters, our mothers, our wives, made it happen. Applause filled the room. But outside, in the streets of Detroit and Seattle and Pittsburgh, there was no cheering, not yet. The women who had built the war machine were still working, finishing the last orders, sealing the last crates. At Willow Run, the assembly line had slowed for the first time in 4 years. Machines idled. The smell of oil still hung in the air, but the thunder had gone. Margaret Lewis stood beside the final bomber to roll off the line, its nose art read, "Home stretch." A photographer asked her to pose with a wrench in hand. She smiled politely, but her eyes were distant. "Feels strange," she said softly, like a song ending mid-note. Lydia Ramos chuckled beside her. "Maybe we just start a new one." The factory foreman, Joe McAllister, raised his voice above the quiet. "That's the last B-24, folks. You did it. War's over." Silence. Then applause, hesitant at first, then roaring. But many were crying too. They had lived inside these walls so long that peace felt alien. Margaret looked around at the faces, tired, proud, changed forever. "We built our way to the end," she whispered. That night the women gathered outside beneath the Michigan sky. The air was warm, carrying the scent of spring and machine oil. Someone brought a radio. Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade drifted softly through the speakers. Lydia raised a glass of soda and shouted. To the boys who made it home and the girls who got them there, they laughed. Clinking bottles, the glow from the factory windows, flickering behind them like dying stars. Margaret leaned against the railing, staring at the lights reflecting off the tarmac. For the first time in years, she could hear something she'd forgotten, latence. It was almost unbearable. Across the ocean, in the ruins of Berlin, the war was truly over. Von Albrecht walked through the rubble of the old Reich Chancellery past Soviet soldiers hauling crates of documents. He moved slowly, his uniform torn, his boots coated in dust. He paused beside a broken wall plastered with propaganda posters, "Victory through strength." Final victory is near. All lies now. He sat on a piece of shattered masonry and looked at his hands. "We built death," he murmured. "They built life." For the first time, he no longer felt anger, only awe. In Washington, Roosevelt was gone, but his legacy lived on. The factories that had won the war were now turning to rebuild the world. Economists called it the post-war boom, but for the women who had riveted, welded, and forged it, was something simpler: freedom. Some returned home to families and kitchens and quiet streets. Others stayed, refusing to give up the independence they had earned in fire and steel. They became engineers, machinists, designers, the architects of a new America. When asked years later what victory felt like, one of them said, "It sounded like metal, hot, loud, and alive." At Willow Run, the final whistle blew. The doors closed. The great factory that had once produced a bomber every hour fell silent at last. Margaret lingered by the gate, hand resting on the chain-link fence. Lydia approached her lunch pail, clutched under her arm. "Come on," she said softly. "We're done." Margaret smiled, looking up at the faint streaks of daylight breaking through the clouds. "No," she said. "We're just getting started." In the distance, a train whistle echoed, long, steady, triumphant. It rolled past the empty airfields and quiet plants through the towns that had built a miracle. Inside one of its boxcars sat crates of machinery bound for Europe's reconstruction. On the side, someone had scrawled in chalk, "Built by the women who won the war." The train disappeared into the horizon. And for the first time in years, the sound of peace, the hum of a factory slowing to rest, felt just as powerful as the roar of war.